Well, hello and welcome everyone to the dissertation fast track, where I'm going to be unpacking some tried and trusted time-saving tactics for working adults. So, what are you going to learn? What are we going to cover? Well, we're going to break this down into 4 or 5 sections, and these 4 or 5 sections are going to reflect various stages of the typical dissertation or thesis writing process. So what this means is no matter where you are, if you're right at the beginning of the process and you're still just deciding on a topic and coming up with a proposal, or you've already pinned everything down, you've collected your data, and now you're writing up, no matter where you are, there's going to be something in this for you. So let's jump into it. And as I say, we're going to start with the wonderful world of topic ideation. And specifically, how do you approach the topic ideation process to make your life a lot easier? How do you choose the right topic to set yourself up for success, to set yourself up with a manageable project, and a project that is not going to cost you your job, cost you your sanity, or cost you your partner. So let's hope we can avoid all of that stuff by following some tactics here. So first things first, when it comes to choosing a project or choosing a research topic, and when we're talking about a research topic, we're speaking specifically about the combination of your research aims, your research objectives, your research questions, what we tend to call the golden triangle, and we'll unpack that a little bit more later. But when you're talking about, or when you're considering research topics, you want to consider a few factors. And the first is your workplace. And what I mean by this is, ideally, you want to look for problems and challenges and trends within your workplace or within your industry, and specifically the kinds of problems or challenges or opportunities that would benefit your employer. And if you can shape a research topic around those, you're going to make your life a whole lot easier. You're going to get better buy-in from your employer. You're going to get easier access to data that might be client data or supplier data or internal HR data. And of course, you're just going to get the sympathy of your boss, or you're more likely to get the sympathy of your boss in terms of having those days off for you to just focus on your dissertation or thesis if what you're researching is of relevance and of benefit to your employer. So you want to let that be a factor that you consider. Now, of course, we're assuming here that what you're studying and what you're researching is aligned with what you're doing in the workplace. But that if that's not the case, then the assumption is that whatever you're studying is something that you're wanting to do in the future, is where you're wanting to take your career. And so, again, you'll want to think about your career trajectory. What do you want to become an expert in? What do you want to specialize in 5 to 10 years now? And then look at potential topics within that arena. In other words, you can use your dissertation, your thesis, your research project, whatever your university calls it. You can use this as a launch pad and a foundation for developing expertise and credibility in the area that you want to become the expert. So if you're really interested in social media marketing or AI or whatever the case may be, you would ideally want to look at, okay, well, what are the emerging topics here that could lay the foundation for me to become an expert in this in the future? And so that's one aspect you want to look at, the workplace aspect. Second to that is to look at the supervisory aspect. And by supervisor, there's some terminology differences. Yes, we could speak about supervisors, advisors, dissertation committees. In other words, whoever the university is going to assign or has assigned to support you through your project. And you want to look at their research interests. So if your supervisor's already been assigned, this is pretty straightforward because you can just go and look up their research interests on their profile page on the website, on the university website. If they haven't been assigned, then you can make the assumption that you're going to have a supervisor from within your institution. And so again, you're going to look at what are your institution or specifically the department that you're in within your institution, what are their research interests, what are the things that they're interested in. And so where previously we were talking about workplace interests, in other words, what interests you, what interests your employer, now we're looking at it from another angle and saying, okay, the person who's going to help me through this thing, the supervisor, this academic powerhouse that is supposedly going to support me, what are their interests and how can I find some middle ground between these two things? And so that is not always possible, but ideally you want to, if you do have that information, if you do have access and understanding of who you're going to be working with and who's going to be supporting you, then that should really inform how you think about the potential topics that you might entertain. And so you want to find ideally some sort of middle ground here. And by doing that, you're going to, where previously we spoke about getting the buy-in of your employer and getting the support of your employer, now you're going to get the buy-in and the support of your supervisor. You're not going to be just another student that they have to help, but you're going to be someone who's helping them in an area that they're interested in. In other words, you're helping them achieve their research goals or their research aims as well. So that is really, really valuable. There's probably the most common complaint that we get from students when we work with students at Grad Coach is that their supervisor just isn't very engaged, isn't very interested, is pretty detached from their project. And of course, sometimes that problem runs a lot deeper than just pure interest. But if you have a supervisor that's interested in your project, that is interested in your area of research, you're just going to by default have a much richer relationship. And so again, this is about setting yourself up for success. If you can find that topic that has buy-in from your employer, and you can find the topic, and you can find some middle ground in terms of getting buy-in from the supervisor and genuine interest and enthusiasm from the supervisor, then you're really, really going to be winning. And so that is a second consideration. The third consideration is breadth, or rather the absence of breadth. What you want to be doing, this is probably one of the most common pieces of advice, and sometimes it's more than advice, sometimes it's really, really pushing students that we work with, is that whatever you do, you want to go narrow in terms of your focus in a dissertation or thesis or capstone project. What we often see is students that are trying to solve the world's problems, that are trying to take on this mammoth task, or that just haven't really thought about their research questions particularly deeply, and so they're still very broad. What you want to do here is you want to go narrow. And I understand that for someone who's a working professional, this sometimes feels a little bit unrealistic because you're so used to working with complex problems that span over a very wide area of impact and influence. Whereas in academic research, what you actually want to do is you want to go narrow, narrow, narrow. You want to say, I'm just interested in this thing over here, and I'm going to go really, really deep down the rabbit hole there. And so that's just something to keep in mind. So let these three factors influence your thinking. Yeah, that you want to try find this middle ground between a topic that's of relevance, interest, and something that your boss or your employer is going to find useful and beneficial, and has a balance with supervisor's interests. And then to round that off, you want to narrow that in as tightly as possible. So keep those three things in mind when you're thinking about which topic should I go for. If you're mulling between topics, keep these three factors in mind. Before we wrap up this section about topic ideation, I really want to put some emphasis on this, that the choice of topic is probably the most important decision that you're going to make. Your choice of research aims, research objectives, research questions, in other words, the three things that come together to create your topic, this is really what directs your study, and it really can make the difference between creating a living hell, quite honestly, and we see that with a lot of students that chose difficult topics, and creating a project that is a lot more manageable. And that's not to say that a manageable project is going to earn any less marks. In fact, I would argue that the simpler your project is and the more manageable it is, the more likely you are to earn high marks. And so the point to be made here is that you don't want to fall in love with the first topic idea that comes along. It's really tempting. I know students they work all their way through the coursework and they reach the dissertation stage, and they've got this idea that they've been thinking about for the last 2 years or 3 years while working through the coursework, and they're in love with it, and it's a terrible idea. And that's part of the tough work that we do here at Grad Coach, is to get those students to climb off that cliff and to engage in something that is more manageable. And often that just means kind of refining that topic. But the point is, you don't want to just have one option. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and only entertain that. You want to ideally develop a short list of 3 or 4 potential research topics and then systematically evaluate them. And we've got a worksheet for that helps you essentially slice up your potential topics and make an informed decision about that. But if you do want hands-on help with this stuff, that is what we do here at Grad Coach. You can check out our private coaching service. If you want to, you can book a free initial consultation. There should be a link somewhere in this window that you can go book a consultation to speak with our coaches. As best I know, we are rather short on coaches at the moment. Our coaches are really busy, and so if you do want to have a chat with our coaches, see what they can do for you, book an initial consultation. There's no cost to that, no obligation. So Let's move on to the second portion, which is the literature review. Now, the literature review is a monster. It's probably the most common thing that students get stuck on. It's probably the most common stage that students are at when they knock on our door at Grad Coach. And so there's a lot to cover here, and there's various stages of the literature review. There's really finding literature, digesting literature, and then writing up. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm just going to focus on one of the biggest challenges that students have, especially adult learners, and that's how to digest all of this dense literature in and not spend a year or two doing it. You know, how do you get through this stuff faster? How do you do this like something of a research ninja? And the short answer to all of this is you don't have to read everything. So often students are trying to just conquer an endless mountain. You know, absolutely any research article, journal article that touches on the some part of their research topic. And again, this is where having a really narrowly defined research topic that I spoke about earlier, that's where this becomes really important, is that if your research topic's really broad, that means you've got to read a lot more stuff. Whereas if your research topic's really narrow, then generally speaking, you're going to have less of a reading list. Of course, you're still going to have to look at the full picture, but obviously, if you're narrower in scope, you don't have to read as much. But regardless of what your scope is, you don't need to read everything. You've got to be selective. So how do you go about this? How do you actually approach this? I think the simplest thing to keep in mind is that your research aims, objectives, questions, in other words, the three components that create your research topic, those are the filter through which you will assess whether something is relevant. And so let's look at the process that you use here to move through this stuff without reading everything, and without, when you do read things, without spending hours upon hours reading a single article. So we call this the layered approach, and essentially there's three layers to it. Layer one is what we call the scan. And at this point in time, you're on Google Scholar or whatever research database you might be using. And what you're looking for is you're just scanning the titles of various articles that are coming up for your keywords of interest. Of course, your keywords of interest are determined by your research aims, your research questions, your title. And what you're doing at this point is you're just looking through the results pages and going, but judged on the title, not on anything else, just judged on the title. Is there some relevance here? Does this look like this would be relevant to my my area of research? And you want to take quite a liberal approach here. You want to just, if something's sitting on the edge, include it. And so you want to go through layer one, you want to scan just based on title, and then you want to download all of those resources, or at least bookmark them before you download them. Then once you've completed that, you're going to go to layer two, which is the skim. And the skim is essentially strategically skim reading this list of articles that you've created to understand, are they relevant to my specific context, to my specific set of research aims and questions and objectives. So yeah, you're not reading the whole article, because that's going to take a huge amount of time and you're just going to drown. So what you're going to be looking at is three components: the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion. You might also look at the methods if that's relevant to your research objectives or your research aims. If your research aims have something to do with methodology. But at this point in time, you can focus on just the abstract, which is usually just a short portion up front, the introduction, often about a page long, and the conclusion, often about a page long, if not less. And that's going to give you a snapshot understanding of what was this article trying to understand, what was the study about, and what did they find? And with those two pieces of information, you'll know very quickly, is this relevant to me? The other thing that you want to have a look at this point in time also is just have a look at how well cited is this article. Is this something that looks reasonably credible? Now, we don't have time to dig into the whole credibility thing. We do have resources covering that on the Grad Coach blog, but at this point, you do want to, apart from just looking at an article and saying, is this relevant? You also want to say, well, is this thing legit? Is this a piece of research that I can trust? And so that's what you're doing at this stage. And so you're creating a shortlist, and at this point in time, you're kicking out. So in layer one, you were including, you're saying, okay, these potential titles here are of interest to me. And in layer two, you're going, okay, cool. I started with, let's say, 100 articles. Let me now start kicking things out that are clearly not relevant, clearly a bit dated, perhaps aren't credible, et cetera, et cetera. And you're doing that on the basis of the skim read that you do. Then, of course, layer 3, this is where you actually start getting into the meat of each article. So now you've got a much shorter list of articles, and you're going to actually read them, generally speaking, from start to end. You're going to actually immerse yourself in these things. And so this is where you start understanding what the state of literature is. What is it? What are the conversations that are going on in relation to your topic? What are the things that are being discussed? And how does this all come together in relation to your research questions and your research aims? And so at this point in time, you want to be reading, you want to be absorbing, but you also want to start building a catalog. And by a catalog, what I mean is this can be something like just a basic Excel spreadsheet where you're putting the title of the article that you read and just concisely a concise summary of like, how is this relevant to me? How does this potentially link to my research aims and my research questions? What does this tell me? What are the key takeaways? So that's what you ideally want in a catalog at a minimum. And we do have a template for that, which you can grab on the Grad Coach website. That is free, and that is a useful way to stay organized. Now, why do you need to catalog this stuff? The bottom line is you're not going to remember. You're going to be reading tons and tons of articles, and you might think that you're going to remember that this person said that and this person said that, but you're not. And so you've got to get that all summarized. And one document is a great place to put it. The great thing about using a spreadsheet-based catalog is that you can also start creating custom fields for yourself. You can include keywords, and then you'll be able to filter by that and sort by that and sort by date and whatnot. So it becomes useful when you actually get to the writing up stage of the literature review. So that's what you want to be doing. Yeah, you want to be building that catalog. And what you also want to be doing while you're reading through these articles is checking who these articles referenced in their arguments and just making sure that those are either worth or not worth your time to read. So this is a strategy called snowballing, and it's basically just looking at, for any given article, what does their reference list consist of? Is any of that stuff relevant to me? So there is a bit of a cycled approach here, a bit of an iterative approach where you're using your layer 3 literature to then pull you back to sort of layer 2, and then you'll go through that cycle a few times. So that is how you move through the literature review, or at least the reviewing of the literature stage, a lot quicker than what many students do, which is to just sit down and try to read everything. The bottom line is you've got to be picky. You've got to be fussy about what you're going to read. Your time is a very, very valuable resource. And of course, you've got to be thorough. You can't cut corners in an academic research project, but you also don't need to feel obligated to read absolutely everything that is even remotely connected to some aspect of your research question. So let's move on to the next section, methodology. Literature review tends to frustrate students the most. Methodology tends to confuse students the most. So let's talk about, again, this is one of these topics where, there's so many angles that we could cover, but what we're focusing on in this discussion is how you, as a working adult, as someone with limited time, how you can move faster, how you can work more efficiently. So I'm going to speak about how to play to your strengths in terms of the methodology. So first things first, and this is probably going to seem pretty obvious, but I can't stress it enough, is you want to start with the research ethics policies of your university. Research ethics policy being one component, and then just the brief and the requirements for your project being another component. This is really, really important. It's in fact, I'd say it's the single most important consideration when it comes to your methodology and arguably even your research topic, because there might be research topics that are just off bounds as well. So what are we talking about here? Every university is going to have a research ethics policy, and that ethics policy is going to essentially describe, in terms of primary research, in other words, data that you can collect from people or from animals or whatever the case may be, what you can and can't do. And this is going to vary. It's not standardized across institutions. It varies by country. It varies by discipline, et cetera, et cetera. But these are hard rules. And the bottom line is it doesn't matter how juicy your research topic is, how interesting it might be to your employer, how interesting it might be to your supervisor. If it runs into some sort of ethical issues, you're done for. You're not going to get approval, and you're not going to be able to move forward. And so this is really important. So start before you even, we're talking about methodology now, but before you even get onto a research topic, do yourself a favor and do the boring work of reading through the ethics policy of your university. And of course, read through the briefing document for this specific project from your university. That's going to tell you exactly what you can do, what you can't do, what type of data you can collect, what kind of data you can't collect. For some research projects, it might be that you have to collect primary data. For others, it might be that you have to collect secondary data or something like that. So start with that. And another little point that's just worth being made here is that there are, in many cases, there are research projects that will get ethical approval, but they come with qualifications, they come with additional complexities. So for example, if you decide to do research that involves collecting data from children or from the elderly or any sort of vulnerable group, then you're going to have a much stronger oversight from your university. There's going to be more approval processes in place. There's going to be all sorts of safeguards that they have to do and restrictions that they need to place on you in terms of how you undertake your research. So you don't want that. You don't want to be in a space where there's more admin, there's more people to engage with. So get clarity on that, get clarity on what the policies are, and let that inform both the thinking regarding your research topic, but also your methodology, as we'll get into. So start with ethics. All right, now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about how you actually shape your research methodology. And the really important thing to understand here is that your research methodology is essentially a product of the golden triangle: the research aims, the research objectives, the research questions. Again, if this stuff sounds a little bit foreign, we've got loads of content on the website. Or if you want to grab a consultation with us and have a chat through it, then we can do that as well. So the important thing to understand here is that your research aims, your objectives, your questions, these inform all of your methodological choices, from the sort of philosophical stuff through to the abstract stuff. So we don't have enough time to really dig into this, but as an example, if your research aims are to explore people's attitudes towards something, a phenomenon or event or whatever, in other words, you're trying to understand attitudes and beliefs and feelings, then that's going to lean your methodology towards qualitative. You're probably going to use interviews to collect data. You're going to have conversations with people, and then you're going to use some sort of qualitative analysis method like thematic analysis or something like that. And so there's an immediate impact or immediate relationship and a direct relationship between that type of research aim, the thing you're trying to figure out, and how you're going to figure that out. On the flip side, if your research aims are to measure things, so for example, the relationship between X and Y, or how one thing impacts another, then that is going to imply a quantitative approach. It means that you're probably going to collect statistical data, survey data, and you're going to do some sort of statistical analysis on that. There might be descriptives or inferentials, whatever the case may be. So that might sound a little wishy-washy and perhaps doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but the important thing that I'm trying to get across here is that your methodology is a product of, obviously, your research ethics policies that we spoke about. You can't do something if it's not allowed. But really what needs to inform your research methodology is these three things on the screen right now. These are the key things. And so students get really tangled. Should I do this? Should I do that? I read that this study did this, and I saw that my friends are doing that, and this one's collecting this kind of data, and this one's doing this sort of statistical analysis. Should I do it? The answer is no. The answer is the way that you approach your methodology depends on these three things over here. And so if you have a look through the Grad Coach blog, we've got a ton of information about how this all plays out in practical ways, and how you align your methodological choices with your research aims, objectives, and questions. And so that does provide a lot more information. So that's really something important to understand from the outset. All of that said, there is always a compromise when it comes to research methodology. Students get tangled in this idea of establishing the perfect methodology. In order to achieve my research aims, I need to collect this data from these people, and I need this sample size, and this. And for any given research question, there's always a perfect methodology that you could craft on the back of that. In other words, an ideal methodology. That doesn't mean that you'll have perfect results, but at least methodologically it's as sound as possible. But the reality is that you're working within a set of constraints. And chances are, as an adult learner, as someone that's doing this part-time, your constraints are quite substantial. In other words, you're going to be quite limited in terms of time. You're going to be quite limited in terms of the data set that you have access to. You might have budgetary constraints, etc., etc. There's a lot of factors to consider. And so there's always a compromise with a methodology, and you don't want to get tangled up in trying to do something that is not entirely doable. So for example, we might see that students want to do a quantitative study and they need a sample size of 300 people, and that will give them fantastic results that they can generalize, et cetera, et cetera. But then when it comes to actually collecting that data, they get 30 responses and they're in a panic. What do I do now? And so you've got to be very, very realistic when you're figuring out what is my methodology going to look like. You've got to be very realistic in terms of saying, what data do I have access to? What resources do I have access to? Who are the people that I can speak to, et cetera, et cetera. You essentially want to start with what resources do I have access to, and then reverse engineer your methodology from that. And of course, that's not ideal because, as I just said, your research methodology needs to be informed by your research questions and your research aims, in other words, your research topic. And so this really goes all the way back to what we spoke about in the beginning, which is if you have access to X, Y, and Z resources, you want to be thinking about that at the topic stage. You want to be thinking about, okay, given these resources that I have, what are the kinds of questions that would be useful to answer that I can answer with this data? So that's a whole lot of information. Hopefully that makes sense. One other thing to keep in mind is that you also want to consider your personality. Yeah. If you're a numbers person, if you're a quant head, if you love statistics, then it would make sense to play to your strengths and adopt a methodology and accordingly a topic that is more quantitatively oriented. Whereas if you're the kind of person that likes to have conversations, that likes to engage with people, then qualitative is probably going to be a good fit. And so again, I'm speaking in very practical terms here. Obviously, what's really important is that your methodology fits with what you're trying to figure out. But the bigger picture here is that you want to be thinking about all of these methodological constraints and limitations, et cetera, right in the beginning when you're choosing your research topic, so that you play to your strengths and that you set yourself up with a topic where it's easy for you to get the data that you need. It's easy for you to get the support you need. It's easy for you to do the analysis that you need. There aren't massive learning curves. So keep that in mind. And then the final word on methodology is keep it simple. Keep it simple. We see so often, we see students coming in and they are at some level trying to impress their supervisor or their marker or even their grad coach with these big ideas, these really complex research designs and methodologies. Our general rule of thumb is keep it as simple as possible. Do something simple, do it really, really well. That's how you're going to earn marks. In practical terms, we often see students coming with mixed methods ambitions, and whilst mixed methods certainly has its place and it can be a really powerful approach methodologically, it is very often overkill for a lot of the studies that we see. And so students can just tangle themselves up in a way too complex research methodology and end up doing it poorly, and then end up with a study that has a whole bunch of holes in it, as opposed to having a study that's a little bit narrower in scope, a bit simpler in terms of design, but really, really well pulled off. That's what earns marks. So that, I think, covers it for methodology. As I said, this is an area that students tend to really struggle with and be intimidated by. So if you do need hands-on help with this stuff, remember you can grab a consultation with us and we can talk you through the options. In worst case, we can just point you to some resources. So that is there for you. All right, let's jump on to the next section, which is writing up. So this kind of applies across the board, but it is something that's really, really important. And specifically for you as an adult learner, as a working professional, how do you move faster? There's a lot of writing to do in a dissertation. Generally, we're talking 20,000, 30,000 words at master's level, much more than that at doctoral level. There's a lot of writing up to do. And it's something that students can get really, really stuck on. They can get writer's block. They can get absolutely twisted in all of this. So I'm going to focus on how you can move faster through the writing process. And it's this weird paradox here in that in order to move faster, you've got to move slower. And what I mean by moving slower is, you've got to take a iterative approach. When you are writing a project of this size, you're not going to sit down and just hammer out the perfect sentence, the perfect paragraph, the perfect chapter the first time around. It sounds really attractive. It sounds really time efficient. Like student thinks that, okay, if I just sit down and I just concentrate, I can write this thing right the first time and then I don't need to come back to it, and that's going to save me time. The reality is that that doesn't happen. If you try to get the first piece of, if you try to get any piece of content out and get it right the first time round, you just get stuck in writer's block and you just end up procrastinating for days or weeks or months. And we see this all the time. This is, again, one of these common issues that students knock on our door for. So what's the alternative? How do you iterate? And that sounds simple enough in principle, but what's the method here? We propose a sort of 3-step method, and it is to outline, to vomit, and to clean up. And that is not a particularly glamorous name for a framework, not particularly academic of us, but it really, really gets to the point of what we are proposing. So what does this mean? So for any given chapter, for any given section, the first thing you want to do is you want to create a rough outline structure. So yeah, we're just talking about some bullet points. You just want to have a rough mapping in a Google Doc or Word document or in your notes-taking environment, whatever the case may be. You want to have a rough outline. You want to work out, okay, roughly what am I going to cover and in what order? And that's step one. Then what you're going to do is you're going to start vomiting into that set of notes, into that outline. And again, I apologize for the very a crude explanation here, but this is what you're doing. And why we say vomiting is that the idea is not to take this outline and then go and fill in perfect sections. The idea is to use this outline as an opportunity to get stuff out of your head and onto paper in a very, very crude, rough fashion. And no one's going to see this. This is only for you. The idea is to essentially dump it out of your head onto paper into the relevant sections and to free up hard drive space, because while you have a whole chapter floating around in your head, or perhaps even a whole dissertation, you can't really write, you can't really make any progress, because you just, like, all of your RAM has been taken up, or your hard drive space has been taken up by all of this content that's floating around in your head, and you're thinking about how you're going to link this piece to that piece, etc., etc. So what you want to do is say, okay, here's my rough outline. Boom, let me put all of the stuff in there. And what's important here is to just be really easy on yourself. So you don't need to go from an empty outline to a full outline in one go. You can do it in pieces. You can fill in the end part first and then come to the middle, and then maybe you get a little bit stuck and you realize, don't quite know what to do there, but I do know what to do. Yeah, so let me go pluck this in over there. And you basically are just doing a patchwork of taking stuff out of your mind and figuring out loosely, where does this go in the outline? And as you do that, what you're going to find is that, okay, I thought that this was what the outline would look like, but actually maybe we should move that up over there. We should introduce this new section over here. We should fiddle and tinker and readjust this. And that's completely fine. So you're going in a sort of loop from number 1 to number 2 and just getting stuff out of your head and figuring out loosely, what does this look like? What is this? How does this manifest on a piece of paper? And so you're going to go through that cycle a few times until you get to a point where you can confidently say, okay, I think I've thought of all of the stuff, and I think I have all of that down in some way, shape, or fashion on this outline list. And so now we can progress to section number 3, or step number 3, which is to actually start cleaning that up. So this is where you're going to say, okay, how do I take this garbage and fit it into, or sharpen it up into a good narrative? How do I connect these ideas? How do I make all of this work? And even in stage 3, you're going to find that, as you do this, wait a minute, I should have explained, I should have had another section. Yeah. And so this is just, you can see the loops are just going around and around and around. And the idea here is that you're starting rough, you're getting it out of your head, and then you're working on cleaning it up. If you're trying to clean it up as you write it, it's just overload. You just get completely stuck, you get gridlocked, and you don't write anything. And then everything sits in your head, stress builds up, anxiety builds up, and you just start procrastinating, and writer's block sets in. So this is a process. This is something that students don't like to hear. That when we sort of sell them this story, they don't like the idea of it because it sounds like it's so much longer. But the reality is that you actually move a hell of a lot faster going through this mechanism than you do trying to get everything right the first time. You don't realize that when you are trying to create the perfect first draft, it's just so time consuming, and you actually, not only do you take more time, but you produce a poorer piece of work because you're so zoomed in to each specific section, as opposed to understanding how does this whole thing fit together as a full narrative. So that's really, really important. A little line, excuse the rather dark looking slide here, but a little line that we always remind our students of is, get comfortable killing your babies. You're going to, through this writing process, you're going to write a lot of things, delete a lot of things. You're going to be moving things around. You're going to spend a whole lot of time, dumping a whole lot of content and then going, actually, that's rubbish and it's not relevant to what I'm speaking about. And you're going to have to kill it. And you have to get comfortable with that. You can't get attached to any piece of writing in the same way that you can't get attached to the first topic idea that comes along. And so that is something that you really, really need to ingrain in your mind. Get comfortable killing your babies. So that covers the 4 sections. So let's just quickly recap on all of these things that we've covered. So the topic, what did we say about topic ideation? If you're right at the beginning of your study, try to find a topic that finds or forms a middle ground between your workplace or your career ambitions and your supervisors or your institution's research interests. By finding a middle ground between those two things, you're really going to make your life a lot easier. You're going to be able to move a lot faster because you're going to have support from your institution, from your supervisor, and from your workplace, which is really, really important. Those are 2 key stakeholders in this project as a working adult. On the literature review side, as we said, don't try to read everything. Be selective, follow or adopt a layered approach, scanning, skimming, and then reading your content. Don't feel like you need to read everything. And remember, again, going back to the topic, the narrower your topic is, the easier this makes everything else, including the literature review, because there's less to read. There's always going to be a lot to read. Let me be clear. There's no getting around this. You have to read a lot, but you can be smart in terms of how you approach that. Looking at the methodology, as we highlighted, you want to start with your university's ethics policy and the project brief, and you want to understand specifically, what am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? What things are going to cause me headaches in terms of ethical approval and review boards and whatever, and let that inform your decision-making in terms of your methodology, but also your topic. Go all the way back to your topic and go, okay, well, am I playing to my strengths here? Am I just creating more of a headache for myself? And then, of course, when it comes to methodological decisions, everything needs to make sense, needs to align with that golden triangle of research aims, research objectives, research questions. And at the same time, there is some compromise there. You're not going to have the perfect methodology. When it comes to writing, as we said, you've got to get comfortable killing your babies. You want to adopt that process of outlining, of vomiting all of your thoughts into that outline in an iterative approach, and then cleaning all of that up and perhaps circling back a few times. So those are the 4 key strategies or tactics for these 4 stages. Of course, the magic sauce in all of this is getting feedback, getting input, and that is something that applies at all levels. So that is the content for today wrapped up. Don't stop now. As I mentioned, we've got tons of free resources on the website. We've got free articles, we've got how-to guides, we've got videos, templates, worksheets, there's other webinars as well. All of that stuff is for free at gradcoach.com. And you definitely want to make use of that. And then if you would like hands-on help, grab an initial consultation. There's no cost, there's no obligation. We'll just talk through where you're at and what we can do to help you.